In 55 BC, the famous Julius Caesar set out from mainland Europe with a moderately sized force of around 10,000 men. His destination was the island of Britain, a land long shrouded in mystery and legend to the Romans. Accompanying him on this journey of exploration and conquest was his Belgic ally, Commius, king of the Atrebates, just one tribal group amongst many who Caesar had dealt with over the last few years. Ever since becoming the governor of Cisalpine and Transalpine Gaul in 58 BC, Caesar's power and fame had grown as he had expertly played off Gallic, Germanic and Belgic nations against one another in a masterful strategy of divide and rule. Commius was one of the Belgic kings who initially profited from Caesar's policies, and after Caesar's conquest of the Atrebates in 57 BC, he was made a client king to Rome. Even at this relatively early stage in Roman history, Roman armies tended to heavily rely on the support of detachments of auxiliary soldiers from warlike nations beyond the frontier, who would complement their standard heavy infantry. Commius was no exception, and he commanded an elite unit of Belgic and Gallic cavalry. Caesar's first expedition to Britain, and ultimately his second a year later in 55 BC, ultimately ended in failure, besides increasing his own personal fame. Although Caesar glosses over the incident in his own writings, Romans may have barely escaped with their lives back to the mainland. It's likely that Commius was instrumental to their survival, reportedly being able to muster additional horsemen from within Britain after the Roman ships had become badly damaged by storms, thus suggesting a pre-existing Belgic presence on the island. By 54 BC, however, in the face of continued Roman harassment and involvement in Gallic affairs, the winds of change began to blow through the disparate kingdoms which Caesar had played against one another. The various nations of Gaul, never before united, began to set aside their differences in the face of the Roman invader, whose overlordship was often cruel and characterised by unnecessary violence and harassment. It would be a young Auvergne ruler named Vercingetorix who would lead them to war in 52 BC. A fierce and charismatic warrior from a noble family, Vercingetorix mustered the various nations together for one final definitive campaign. Caesar, however, being an expert politician and strategist, had maybe even planned for this all along, knowing that he could legitimately annex Gaul in its entirety in the face of such a defiance to his will. It is at this stage, in the face of such a rebellion, that the loyalty of his friend and ally Commius began to be called into question. What happens next is unclear, but it seems that begrudgingly Caesar dispatched a small group of centurions to murder his one-time friend. Commius, however, had other plans. A fierce warrior from a long line of kings, he was able to fight his way out of the ambush and survived with minor injuries, now definitively vowing to join the Gallic alliance once and for all, and to take the fight directly to the Romans. It's unclear whether Commius had indeed betrayed Caesar prior to this, but after the plot he certainly did change sides. During the Battle of Alesia in September 52 BC, Commius was one of the high kings who answered the call for assistance, and marched with a massive army in an attempt to relieve Vercingetorix from his besiegement. Caesar, one of the greatest battlefield commanders of all time, was hugely outnumbered, but against all the odds, to the misfortune of the Gallic alliance, he went on to win the battle, and ultimately subjugated the entirety of Gaul, annexing it as a new province. After Alesia, Commius returned to his homeland in modern-day Belgium with a mounted warband in order to wage a campaign of guerrilla warfare against the Romans. After suffering defeat at the hands of his old friend Mark Antony in 51 BC, he agreed to no longer resist Caesar, on the condition that he be allowed to leave mainland Europe and never again have to meet another Roman. Antony granted his wish, and Commius travelled back across the Channel to Britain, where he would live out the rest of his years as king of the Atrebates in Britain. Ultimately, Antony would keep his word, and the Romans would not return to Britain again for over 100 years. It would be Commius's descendants who would fight Emperor Claudius in 43 AD, when the Romans returned to conquer Britain once and for all.